Yeah, so this is melee combat specifically from the perspective of design and tech. So relating to how this will work in the Roblox engine and basically design compared to industry standards of melee combat and game development in general. My name is Val. Let's see. This is my creepy avatar. It's creepy on purpose. If you find any, I guess, interesting things that go with a skeleton body, let me know. So I'm a senior physics engineer at Roblox, but today I come to you as a gamer. I really like player versus player games. I really like one-on-one combat. I spent most of my 4th of July playing competitive World of Warcraft, so that should tell you a lot. Didn't get my goal, but you know, I tried, felt good. But yeah, I've been playing a lot of melee combat games lately. For Honor is probably one of the coolest things I've ever played so far, so you have a chance to check it out. But yeah, today I'll be talking to you about just game development instead of physics. So the way this talk's going to go is I'm going to kind of start off breaking down industry and how it compares to Roblox. We're going to talk a little bit about shooters. We're going to talk about melee games. And then we're going to break into discussing melee combat, specifically what makes it fun, how to make it engaging, what kind of things you're trying to go for when you're designing melee combat games. After that, we're going to break into, I guess, what I would call design a game, which is a little disingenuous because I've already kind of made a programmer version of a melee combat game with a lot of programmer art and programmer animation. And we're going to kind of look through that game, talk about the systems that I've chosen, why I've chosen those systems, and at the end of it all, we're going to look back on everything I've talked about and then also basically do some self-critique and talk about the feedback loop for you as a developer of how you should take your prototype and polish it to actually make it a much more interesting game. So let's dive into it. Let's see. So I've been at Roblox for about 4.5 years now, longer than that actually, and I've been watching the content on Roblox evolve, and it's actually been really amazing. The kind of games I see have been really impressive to me. Look at shooters in general. So shooters in the games industry I think the biggest thing to point out about them is that I feel like there's really only one way to do shooting games correctly in the industry, especially first-person shooters. You'll notice that no matter whether you're playing Destiny or a military simulator game, there's a few constant design standards that people follow. Things like favor the shooter, making sure that the shooter usually gets the more favorable interaction over networking. Things like, for the most part, the other person has not really much to say about how they're going to defend themselves. Their only defense is being passive. So in a way, shooting games in industry end up being what I would call one-directional interactions. If you see somebody on your screen and your bullets can reach them, you're going to be able to hit them without them being able to do anything. And I would say that Roblox games have actually caught on in terms of gameplay quality and depth quite quickly. I'm actually really impressed with a lot of these games. You know, I can get the same kind of excitement and gameplay needs that I would get from Call of Duty, you know, playing Phantom Forces, playing polygons. And I think, you know, their standards of animation, gameplay quality are really cool. So, yeah. Now let's dive into melee. So melee is kind of a more interesting thing. As you'll watch this video, you'll notice that melee combat actually looks like it doesn't really have a standard. So if you see different games, you'll usually notice that a lot of them feel super different to play. Part of that is because there pretty much is no standard, and there's very many unique ways of implementing melee combat. The one thing you will notice is that a lot of melee combat usually involves both the attacker and the defender interacting. And that's part of what makes melee combat design challenging, but also fun. This bidirectional gameplay is something that you kind of want to achieve in your game, where you feel like even though you're on the defensive, you're still interacting with the other person in some way or form, whether actively or passively. Jumping into Roblox, I feel like Roblox melee games have come a long way. Really cool animations, really cool gameplay styles, really cool RPG elements, but I feel like majority that I've played a lot of times feel like they're still following the shooter design of one directionality, in the sense that if you're close enough to punch somebody, you're just going to punch them and hit. And in the end, a lot of these fights end up looking like people are just smashing each other in the face, not really doing too much. There's not really reactivity. I do want to point out Legendary, which is going to be the next clip, where basically they've started implementing some of the things that I'm going to be talking about in this talk, and I'll be going over why it's super important. So Legendary has something that I call Stagger, and I think this is super important for melee combat design, and I'll go over it as this talk goes on. So this is my little diagram to basically show the differences in shooter and melee design and why certain decisions have to be made, why you have to consider different things for different games. So in shooters, usually your gameplay interactions take place over longer distances. So the top diagram is a good way of kind of showing off that, hey, even if there's some latency involved, what you're going to see in terms of positional errors of other players is going to be small, and majority of your interaction with the other player is this. I was shooting at him. Was he behind a wall? Was my bullet fast enough? No, then I probably hit him. That's the kind of interaction you will see over kind of a networking diagram in a shooter game, so it's much easier to design. Now, melee combat is a lot more complicated, right? You're in someone's face, so with latency, you're going to notice positional errors more. You're going to notice delays in attack starts more, and you're basically constantly interacting, right? Because you swing a big sword at somebody, that guy might move out of the way, or they might actually punch you in the throat and stop you from swinging that sword. But you have a lot more of that kind of back and forth interaction, and I think that's something you have to consider a lot of when you're designing melee combat games. And I think this diagram kind of shows why the designs are so different and kind of why melee combat is actually more difficult to make than shooting. So let's break into making a good melee combat game. How do you do it? Well, there's more than one way of doing it. So I'm going to focus on the specific archetype that I really like. Because if you've played games for as long as I have, there's many different kinds of melee combat games. There's Dynasty Warriors where you're just this crazy dude who can wipe out an army with like not even with a sword, but like a fan that you use for when you're like hot in the summer. But the game type that I'm specifically going to focus on is something that focuses more on duels. So the archetype and the ideal that I'm trying to set up with the game that we're going to be designing here is the perfect duel. So think of old samurai movies, think of animes where two opponents kind of face each other on the field, and before they even start punching each other, they're kind of having this like face-off, they're pacing each other, they're trying to figure out what the other person can do. And it's like this sense of like mutual respect, this sense of understanding that, hey, I'm going up against someone dangerous. I don't want to just run in there and just, flail my arms and hope I would win. I want to see what they can do, and I want to respond in that way. So the kind of environment you want to create is basically this balance of defense and offense, and also trying to trick the opponent into doing something that is beneficial to you. So let's break into kind of what an attack in melee combat looks like. A lot of them are, they'll have universal things like every attack will have some time that it'll take for an animation to play before it hits. Can attacks be interruptible? Can you stop something once it starts? Stagger, I'm going to keep mentioning Stagger because it's super important. Stagger is the thing that lets you communicate to the player who got hit that they screwed up better than any health bar ever would. Because if you make a game where people are just slapping each other and the only thing that's going down is their health bar, that's pretty much how they're going to play. And most people aren't going to pay attention to their health bar until they die. And they're not going to get this feeling of, hey, getting hit is a bad thing. So in the end, we're going to end up, the gameplay scenario I like to call as toddler karate. I don't know if you ever walked by like streets of LA or something like that, and there's a karate class and they have like 5-year-olds and they're all sparring, but all their sparring looks like this to each other. And it's just like, you don't want that in a gameplay format. It's like, why does that kid have a red belt? I don't agree with that. And then the other obvious things in universal concepts is basically, you want your attacks to do damage, right? Because in the end, the health bar is the final piece of information you want to give to people. But additionally, you also want to have chains and combos. And what I mean by that is if your game is basically just, a guy has one sword move, two sword move, and nothing else, that's not really that interesting gameplay. You're basically making tic-tac-toe where people have already resolved the problem, and there's not much to experiment with. Now, defenses. Yeah, there's many different ways you can do defenses. I prefer things like dodge, block, and parry. This might be the Dark Souls model. This is definitely the For Honor model. These are defenses that, they're different ways to defend yourself, and they expose different things, but they also provide different things to the person who's doing defending. And what I mean by that is essentially block in every single game is kind of your passive, safe thing to do. You can almost always block, and in most fighting games, blocking doesn't prevent damage. Blocking just makes the damage you have to take smaller. So dodging is also something that basically puts you out of position, moves you around. It's also a somewhat safe defense, but it's not one you can follow up easily. Not super interesting, but still something really important. Now, the thing I want to highlight is parry. Parries are awesome. It's really hard to describe why parries are awesome, except unless you've played a game that has a really satisfying parry system. But parries are something that essentially takes an opponent's attack and throws it against them in a way that, A, makes you feel like, wow, I did that. That is awesome. And also in a way that makes the other player think, wow, I am going up against someone who did that. Like, they're really cool. I'm kind of worried about following up the same problem. And the big thing about parries is that usually they're a risky thing that when it pans out, it makes you feel like you've done something really cool. And that risky behavior is kind of what you want to encourage in games when you're making melee combat games. Now, one of the most important things to consider is that with these defenses and offenses, you really need to consider what is the balance of defense and offense, because there's basically two spectrums you can end up in if you don't do this correctly. You can end up in a very offensive game, so you have toddler karate, and on the other hand, you have knight in armor but no sword, and you're basically unable to hurt each other, and you're kind of just sitting there, and neither of those is fun. So you want something that's like in between, where essentially, in the end, what you're forcing people to take action, and people that are taking action are considering what are the risks of each individual action. Can the other person counter it? So what I mean by this is basically you want to design your game that it provides gameplay feedback to enforce those decisions. You want feedback that says, I want to stop spamming my attacks. You want feedback that says, I don't think just holding my shield up like this all day is that useful. And you want feedback that says, I want to take risks sometimes. If you take anything away from this talk, I want you to remember two things: Stagger and parry. I was surprised to find out that pretty much every melee game I've looked back, even ones that I remember not having a stagger system, actually all have a stagger system. I was thinking that Dragon Ball Z games would be a perfect example of games where dudes just stand in each other's face and punch forever, and then whoever loses their health more loses. But if you watch some of the gameplay videos from recent Dragon Ball Z games, even they, from a light hit, somebody gets staggered and they're out of combat for a few important milliseconds. And that's because stagger is such an important feedback tool for saying, hey, I messed up. I should stop doing whatever I just did to get staggered. And that prevents this kind of spamming attack. Parry is also another thing you want to take away, because parry accomplishes a bunch of things. It gives a goal to a new user of cool things I want to accomplish, but it also rewards mastery. And if you're somebody who becomes someone who can parry consistently in a game, you're going to be someone that people will be afraid to fight, but at the same time want a challenge to learn from. And that's a good combination of feedback systems that prevent you from playing in uninteresting ways, and also something that you can master and work on depth over time. And that's kind of what you want in your game. You want a game that's approachable and gives you good feedback, but also has a lot of places where you can try to master and become a better player, essentially. So let's look at some examples. So this is kind of a combination of, if you block an attack, this is kind of what it looks like, but here's why staggers are really important at communicating. That kind of animation and loss of control from being hit in other games is a good way of saying, hey, whatever I'm doing right now is not working. I should step back and think about it. You saw the last clip was from Legendary, and that's kind of what I mean, is that they actually have a stagger system that reinforces this. But in the end, staggering is super important because it slows down the game a little bit and also basically tells you that, hey, I should back up, rethink this. Parries are, they're just awesome. When you pull one off, you feel really cool. Oh wow, sound's on. And basically, they're that thing that, especially with a good animation, it's something that just looks cool and makes you feel cool. And it's something that you kind of want to fish for just to pull them off, just because they're just really fun and they reverse the momentum of the fight. They're also a good system to make sure that if the enemy is just spamming at you, you can catch that spam because you've picked up on the pattern and turn it up against them. So again, this is something that rewards mastery and provides feedback for the other player to stop being predictable, whatever you're doing. So with all these systems listed, let's try to design a game. I'm going to design a specific game that has these features. There's going to be a stamina system. The reason for that is I want to prevent spamming. So if you just spam attack at someone, eventually you run out of stamina, you'll get tired. And I mean, how long can you swing like a huge two-handed sword for before you're like over it, right? Directional attacks. This is just a personal choice because A, I really like For Honor, and B, it's a lot more interesting to attack when you make the attack being more about not just, hey, I press the attack button, it's like, what direction am I attacking from? And it kind of translates into some real life commonsensical stuff just for fun. I'm adding block, parry, and dodge just because, those are standard and they make sense for a game that I'm trying to build. And primarily with directional attacking, blocking no longer becomes this boring passive action of I held up a shield and I didn't take damage. It's more of a I blocked in the right direction to avoid taking damage. And the final part I'm going to consider is I want to make this game work in multiplayer because multiplayer is the core, I would say, for Roblox. And for me, the one-on-one fight is super important. So think about how attacks and defenses work. I want to have a game where an attacker, when he attacks, he does damage, but he also staggers. Defender can parry, block, or dodge. They can take damage, or they can also be attacking. So you have to consider all of these things that are happening at once any given time when you're designing the game. You have to also consider latency. If you notice that there's lag for, I don't know, say there's 50 milliseconds of lag for some reason. If you have attacks that take less time than that, you may not be able to react. So you have to consider, in my multiplayer scenario, how fast can I actually have realistic attacks that someone can respond to? This is a very important consideration when designing the game. As a general rule of game development, I would always suggest making sure that any kind of new content that you're adding, attack, you make sure that you have a system that lets you just add data. Don't write unique code for every little thing you add. So my example was I was making all these attacks. They were doing damage. They had animation systems. But at some point, I realized, you know what? Sitting here and just hitting a sword like this wasn't fun. What was more fun was that if I added a step to all of my attacks. So all of my attacks now had a movement system. Rather than coding every single movement uniquely, I simply just added an extra piece of data that's like, hey, this is my action movement. So just make sure that as you're making these games, you have systems that make it much easier for you to add extra attacks, extra content without having to write unique code. So with all that said, we want to consider this game from a multiplayer design. You have to consider latency. How does that affect how fast your attacks can be realistically? How do you do hit detection? My game is going to be a little bit of a hybrid. Basically, I am going to trust collision detection if there's multiple players around me, but in a one-on-one scenario, I do want to focus on precise timing. So if I have a heavy attack that normally takes 700 milliseconds, I want it to take 700 milliseconds every time so that people who are fighting and used to fighting each other, they're consistently getting the same kind of timing results that they're used to. You don't want, a duel, all of a sudden a guy starts, attacking his friend from a weird pose just because he found out that his attack comes out faster at that animation rate. So that was kind of my choice. And I wanted to focus on client-driven logic. And the reason for that is, even though there might be a slight amount of desync, I would rather have a game where the person defending who's trying to go for the parry is feeling responsive. Basically, he feels like his game is responsive to his active parrying. And basically, I want to favor activity. It's kind of like the favor the shooter logic you see in most shooting games now. This is favor the active player. So the person who's attacking should feel like his attacks are very responsive, but also the person who's defending should feel like he has a fair amount of time to defend. So with this design condition in place, this is kind of the flow chart of the base game. This is what I want to consider. If you look down in the y-axis, that's kind of the flow of time. You can kind of see how this multiplayer interaction would work. When player 1 starts an attack, it sends out, hey, I'm starting an attack signal, animation's playing, so player 2 gets forwarded an event from the server that says, hey, this attack's coming from the left or the right or whatever direction. It gives you time to think about it. At some point, player 1 figures out that, hey, I think I hit this person, forwards an event to the server, and then the server forwards it to player 2, and player 2 now has a bunch of things he needs to consider whether he's doing or not. Am I dodging? Am I blocking? Am I parrying? And at that point, depending on how either of those results, you either forward the information back or, and basically, trigger a parry, or you take damage. But the whole point is that each of these things is considered on every individual basically on each client. And this kind of helps you think about how does this look like in a network setting. If latency is increased, you can imagine that the amount of time that it takes for attack to get from player 1 to player 2 might take a while. And this is why slower attacks might be beneficial, because if it's only a small percentage of the amount of time the attack takes, you're not going to notice as much of a desync, and overall your game's going to still feel good. Now, parrying. How do I want to implement parrying? If you watch movies, a lot of times parrying looks like two swords clashed in the air, right? And then someone just throws one off balance. So I figured for this sake of simplicity, because I do want to take this game to mobile, parrying for me is going to be a specific window in an attack. So the way that I imagined is, if someone is attacking me and I'm about to anticipate an attack to hit, my parry is just me starting an attack at the last second right before that hit registers. And the important thing about that is that when I try to parry, I lose my ability to block for that period of time. So I've sacrificed my passive defenses in order to be able to try to capitalize on the person attacking me. And this is kind of how it looks like in a networking environment. Player 1, because he still has the same parry window thing, the parry window does pop up, but because no one's attacking, it doesn't matter. So an attack goes through. Player 2 gets a warning. Then player 1 sends another attack event, basically the damage event, but because player 2 has had time to anticipate it, he's now triggering an attack of his own when he anticipates the attack is about to land, and that triggers that parry window, and when the attack hit actually arrives, all of a sudden you trigger that parry, and all of a sudden you can send an event back to player 1 through the server that causes him to cancel the attack and go into a stagger mode, where he's knocked out, and you kind of can capitalize on that. So this is kind of how the flow of the game is going to work. This is the game that we're kind of designing from a networking perspective. And let's look at some of the basic features and how they look. So this is a stagger. This is when you get hit, there's a little animation it shows, and you basically lose control. You can't move when you're staggered. Now, I will say that this stagger animation is kind of lame, and we'll get back to that and how ways we can improve it, because, I don't know, it's not that cool when you're running and you just go like this. Maybe it'd be cool if you had an oof, but this doesn't have sound yet. So blocks. All of these things, you want them to be good feedback systems. So when you try to attack another player and he doesn't take any damage, you want to know exactly why. Because if you're just going to want to blame lag on it, that's not a fun game. So what I added is an animation unique for every direction and a little sparkle. I'm not an artist, so pardon the programmer art. You guys can do a better job. But the point is that the information is communicated. There is feedback that says, hey, he blocked it, and maybe you should try attacking from a different direction next time. Now, parries. Parries are hard to implement because you really do want to make a cool animation, but you also want to make it really obvious that a parry happened. So I wanted to slow things down here. You want to try to make it look like, hey, I deflected that sword and capitalized on the attack. And this is going to be your coup de grace of I feel cool playing my game kind of system. So put a lot of good effort into essentially making these animations and particle effects really look cool, but also make sure they're very obvious. You want to communicate very effectively visually without having to just use health bars or any kind of status symbols. So here is some raw gameplay. And we're going to look at this, and while some of the animations are a little janky looking, we're going to talk about why and how to improve them. By the way, thank you to ParryMaster64 over here for volunteering to duel. So we set out with a goal to make a game where you're not just spamming attacks at each other willy-nilly, you're actually planning out and you're trying to trick each other, you're trying to set each other up for parries and blocks. And I was not telling you to play any specific way. I just told you, fight me. Like, fight me, bro. And we ended up feeling like, the game systems work. We were trying to figure out how to outsmart each other. We were trying to figure out how to catch each other off guard. And in the end, it was a very dynamic experience, so we were trying to throw each other off. But as you can see, animation still can feel a little stiff. There's a few other things missing. So in our post-mortem / conclusion, let's talk about why that feels that way and how do we improve it. So games like this, where you build your first prototype with some basic animations, one of the most difficult things about them is that the tune-up loop, the polish loop, is one of the hardest things to do. Anytime I play my own game, even when I just made an animation, the second day I notice things that I can improve about the animation. And that's the thing. You have to play it to figure out what feels wrong, what feels good. So in our case, as we were talking about Stagger, Stagger feels weird. You're just like, oof, and then you're back, and there's not really much movement. So how can we make that better? Simple things. If you think about it, if I was swinging around a big, two-handed sword and I hit somebody with it, chances are they're not just going to stand there and take it. They're going to get moved out of the way, right? And adding that kind of movement to the physics of an attack is going to make it feel a lot more impactful. So if we were going to be tuning up this game to make it feel a little better, we could add a few simple things. So we're going to add movement to Stagger, depending on which direction you were hit from, and we're going to add a unique animation for each individual direction. These are two simple things to do. They're a little bit of extra code, but their result for how it feels is so much better. So all of a sudden, instead of just oofing in place, you can see the character moves around, is pushed around, and that evokes a better feeling of a fight. Because if you think about it, if you're fighting somebody in melee combat, especially with big swords, there's a lot more motion involved. You suddenly feel momentum of what's going on. There's a lot more being pushed around, and that's kind of the feeling you want to evoke in your melee combat games. You want everything to have weight to it. You want there to be responsive, and you want it to have good feedback. Yeah, we talked about how a lot of this logic is client-driven, and part of the problem with client-driven logic is it's a lot easier to exploit. So if you were making a very competitive game, you would probably want to focus and move a lot of the logic on the server. This is definitely doable. It will probably require a lot more work, and you will lose a little bit of your, predictive / responsive logic on the client, but it will protect you from exploiters more. So I would say if you're designing a game like this, you should consider maybe moving some of the logic on the server. I can even consider right now, instead of having a lot of these individual events happening on the client, you can have a more general system that makes most of the calculations of where the fights happen on the server. The one downside about doing all these checks on the server is that if you are someone who is experiencing latency, for either your own fault or not, if the server thinks that you weren't blocking at some point, you might have a point where you're holding up a sword in an incoming attack and something hits you. So that's what I mean by you're losing up some responsiveness for the sake of security. So it's always a trade-off, like in most engineering problems. Something else to consider is that a paired animation system where you're more aware of when certain things happen. As you saw in my game where we were parrying, when a parry starts, both players might be in two slightly different places. So they kind of do this whole sword twang in individual places. If you were to do something that brings those animations together, brings them closer, and guarantees that the swords actually clash, it'll feel a lot cooler. But again, this is all of these little things that are polished stage. And that's the biggest thing, is that when you're making a game like this, the polish stage will take up most of your time, and the polish stage is going to make it so that your game is no longer about people looking at health bars and trying to get the other health bars down. It's going to be about, hey, my game feels and looks really cool to play. And that is what you want to create. So what kind of conclusions can we basically make of this? First of all, as a challenge to all of you guys, I think there's a huge Roblox market niche for really intense melee combat games. Just like there is for first-person shooters, there's a huge community. It still surprises me there's Phantom Forces montages, and I use them as recruiting videos for Roblox all the time. It's freaking awesome. But basically, if you make a really in-depth, cool melee combat game, and you're the first person to do it, you're essentially going to capitalize on a free niche that's out there and potentially have easy time getting into the market. It is hard. You have to write a lot of your own Lua custom logic, specifically for things like, hey, how am I going to tell the other guy I'm attacking him? How are you going to play the animation systems? You basically have to write your own melee combat engine on top of Roblox. We don't give you anything for free. Part of it is because there's just so many different ways you can make a game. There's no general way to set this up. It's very art intensive. You're going to be making a lot of animations. I made all of my animations, and it's really fun, but I'm still not very good. So, give me a few years. Maybe I'll make For Honor 2 or something. But, working on it. And one really exciting thing is that, so because there's no industry standard for melee combat games, you actually have a lot of room for your own creativity. Even if you make a melee game that doesn't have the same goals as I've set out in my presentation, you can create so many different kinds of melee combat games, and there's no set way of doing it, like a good way or a bad way. You basically have a lot of room to figure out how do you want your game to play, what should it look like. Additionally, as you work on something like this, specifically things that aren't super saturated in Roblox, you're providing good feedback to us about the engine. And the more feedback you provide to us about the engine, the better we can actually make the engine itself. So me working on this game for this presentation made me realize, hey, you know what? Latency would be a really nice thing to tackle. Like, it's actually more important in this case than maybe any shooters in most other Roblox games. So providing feedback for what the engine might improve is super important, and that's how we will improve and make more cool games possible for you guys to create as our users. So it's super cool. Please provide feedback. There was some external material that you guys don't want to check it out. There's a YouTuber called Game Maker's Toolkit. When I watched this video that came out while I was working on this presentation, I actually reshuffled some things around because this video was so good. So take a look at it. It's called What Makes a Good Combat System. It goes over a lot of cool different games and compares them in some cases more in depth than what I'm talking about. And I think it's just super useful for a game design perspective and maybe a historical perspective if you're really into just gaming in general. Here's some external gameplay sources that I used in some of my videos. You can get this list from me if you want later, but they're all cool games, so I would suggest playing them. And here's the Roblox games that I use for all my videos. So yeah, check those out. They're all pretty cool too. And with that, I'll open up for Q&A. Parry Master 64.
We have microphones.
Oh, sorry.
You actually forgot to mention a core mechanic in your game, and that is guard break. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay, yeah. So bring it back to my game. So my game has a lot of mechanics we didn't necessarily cover. I didn't feel like it was super important, but I also added something called guard break. Again, For Honor has this. The cool thing about guard break is you have it there to prevent turtling because it's something that someone can't parry. It's something that someone can't necessarily block. It's just another system to prevent passiveness. And in general, when you're making a game, you have to think about it. What are different things that a user can do at any given time, especially in melee combat, and why would they do anything at any given time? If you have two things that you can do that have the exact same result, the exact same weaknesses, why would you ever do one over the other? So by providing an extra layer of guard breaks and how you're supposed to protect against guard breaks, I'm basically making the game slightly more complicated so that you're not just stuck on the simpler system of blocking and defending. And in general, when you're making a melee combat game, you basically want to avoid it being too simple. If you think of games that are too simple and no one plays them anymore because they're boring and they're solved, think of tic-tac-toe. That's like the worst example. You don't want to be the tic-tac-toe of a melee combat game because everyone knows how to not lose at tic-tac-toe and it's just not fun.
Will the demo that you made at all be open source in the future?
Yeah, so right now I'm really embarrassed of the code that's in it, but my goal is to open source as the systems that I use to hook up events and send these over, and even the data system. So I do want to clean it up, and I do want to open source. It's not available just yet.
Would you mind questions about ranged combat-centric games too?
Sure, yeah.
Would you have any suggestions or just tips on effective collision detection regarding games like that?
So, from what perspective, as in?
Well, for an example, I'm making a game that requires a lot of actual projectiles, like just projectile spam sort of game, not raycasts, actual giant bullets, like nuclear thrown or something.
So, I think in that case, if you wanna, there's no reason you can't just rely on Roblox collision detection. I think the biggest thing you'll run into is networking, right? So
Latency.
what you want to do is you want to make sure that you use the manual network ownership system and make sure that something is locked in place. I'm also identifying that our automatic system that transfers ownership from maybe one player to another is also not doing a particularly good job. So we're going to be taking a pass at that, improving it, and hopefully making it so that for scenarios like this, you don't actually have to do any extra work. But in the meantime, your best bet is to make sure that something is set to be owned by a player and basically the projectile, and make sure that it never leaves that ownership. And that's the set network ownership API. I think that'd be the best bet. And collision detection should take care of things for you. One thing you want to consider is that because the Roblox physics engine is discrete, meaning we don't know time of impact. If something is moving too quickly and our 240 hertz frame just happens to skip over the slice of space that you would have impacted with a really thin wall, you can miss. That's called tunneling, and that's an inherent problem of discrete physics engines, and you might run into that.
Yeah,
so that's
my biggest gripe with Roblox's collision detection is that fast projectiles are just...
Yeah, you can consider, your projectile, you could resolve that if you made the projectile maybe longer, so maybe have the actual collision object be slightly larger. I don't know if you've heard of the Hanzo's arrows in Overwatch, where when you're shooting them, they're like huge logs, and that's part of the reason why you want to do that too. So,
right. Thank you.
Yeah, him. Yeah. Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Do you have any resources you would recommend for making melee systems compatible with ranged systems? Or any just general advice?
So I think, so general advice is I would say maybe play Overwatch. The reason I would say that is because, Overwatch does a bunch of cool things. So they are primarily a shooter, but they have a bunch of characters that are melee combat oriented. And I think they do a pretty good job. Their melee system, my only thing is that their melee systems are very surface level, so you're not going to have parries, but you're at least going to have hits that are reliable. And I don't see why you can't take some of the lessons of this melee combat design talk into ranged. It's just that I guess the specific goals and problems we're trying to solve are quite different. I think if you layer basically, I think if you were making a game with both ranged and melee, I think you would have two parallel systems working at once, because you're not going to necessarily have a parry system for flying arrows at you, right? Mm-hmm. But there's no reason why you can't have a game where you switch modes into ranged combat. As far as good sources, I don't know of any actual articles or videos you can watch. I only know that there's some games that you can try, and I think Mount and Blade is a good, complicated one that's kind of like a semi-indie game. I don't know. People might be offended if I call it an indie game, but they are like a smaller studio. To check it out.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, do you have any input on the concept of combos and such?
So I guess input in what case? So combos are, they can solve multiple things. So combos are there so that your attacks are more interesting, so that you want to string some things together. Other things that combos solve is that sometimes you have a move that is super important and you don't want it to be easy for a character to achieve, so you only attach a specific attack towards the end of the combo. In one of my videos, I think at the end of maybe this one, I have a combo that's It'll be at the end. But at some point, my character is a front flip. But the point is that if you have an attack that you think is too good to be free, just to be doable on the spot, combo is a good way to make something where you have to succeed setting up some pre-steps before you do the super cool attack. I don't know if... Yeah, so that's my understanding of how combos generally work. They're a way to make a super powerful attack more predictable and more fair to defend against, but they're also a way to make it so that when you're attacking, it's not just like a single system. You want to just link some things together. And personally, I don't like the way that having to make complicated button combos works in like Street Fighter. I don't like that Hadoken is like bottom-up B type of thing. Like, why? Why isn't Hadoken just like a single button? But I know that Street Fighter fans will probably hate me for saying that. But basically, to me, combos is something to require a set of precedent before you can do something really cool. Does that kind of answer your question? Or?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Hiya, I'm Chris, or Crikey. I'm wondering whether you think Legendary hit the niche you were talking about earlier, and if it did, what would have made it more successful?
So basically, so Legendary is closest to hitting that niche, I would say, but I think, remember when I was talking about how if you don't have a good amount of layers of complexity, some things might feel, there's like not so much room for mastery. So the things that I would specifically say about Legendary is that it follows a Dark Souls combat system in a good way, and I'm really impressed by it. I was actually playing it for a long time when it first came out, but at some point, you hit a point where the limit of depth of learning is kind of missing. And in Dark Souls, the same melee combat system comes with spells, comes with a bunch of crazy things like backstab, fishing, and layers and layers of things like that. So I think Legendary is very close. I think there needs to be a few extra layers of other systems that you can do. Like maybe there should be a guard break. Maybe there should be more combos, stuff like that. So I think Legendary is super close, but I think there's a little bit less room for mastery there than I would expect from a really deep melee combat game. But again, I can't say anything bad about Legendary because I was playing it for a long time for a while. So.
First of all, I want to thank you for the relative humanoid platforms. It's really good.
Oh, it's not out yet. So, but yes, it will be out soon.
Yeah. Well, you get access on my game, but.
Oh yeah. Okay, got it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, now I know what you
really
look like.
It's really good. Yeah. And also, I wanted to ask you, how do you do hit registration in your demo?
Yeah. So I have 2 layers. So most of the gameplay videos is one-on-one. But I originally designed this game to be 1vx or whatever. So I have 2 things. I have the collider on the sword. When it triggers, then it detects something that is a hittable character. It'll send out events to the server, and the server processes it and is like, oh, I think it was it. But when you're in a one-on-one fight, I have a separate system that does a more discrete check that doesn't involve any physics. And it basically is a check that's like, hey, I know what range I started the attack in. I know where the person was. I know how long this attack takes. And if this attack has a wind-up time of 700 milliseconds before it does damage, I'm gonna basically wait until that 700 milliseconds and then do damage exactly at that moment. So I have a hybrid system of trusting events and ranged when you're dueling someone one-on-one, and does collision detection so that if another person joins, you can still protect yourself from them.
So is that using like ray tracing, or is it like Roblox like native?
So the non-collision, so the collision detection one actually does use touch events. The non-collision detection is really naive, and it basically checks range and how the animation should play out compared to where the person is when it's being hit. One more question? Okay, I guess last question.
So you mentioned that complexity is good. You don't want to have it too boring like tic-tac-toe. But for games that sort of target younger players, they don't really mix well with complexity. Do you have any suggestions for coping with that?
So I don't have super good suggestions on it. I will say that there's a balance basically. So you won't be able to make as a complex game if you're targeting a younger audience. because eventually they'll end up playing against players who are super good, and it's just going to drive them away. It's like if you play Titanfall 2 right now, you're going to walk in there's going to be a guy who flies by at 200 miles an hour, and he'll shoot you in the head, and you won't even know why, and it won't feel good, and you'll quit. The one thing I will say is maybe if you're going to be targeting a younger audience, make your systems more discoverable. So what I really liked about my parry implementation, because it's tied to attack, it's something that you can sometimes accidentally pull off yourself as a younger player. And if you do that and it feels cool, you're going to be like, oh, whoa, what was that? Like, how did I do that? It's kind of like button mashing in fighting games. Someone will one day do a super combo, and they're going to be like, dude, I want to do that. How do I learn? So your best bet is you can still make the game a little simpler, but make it also more discoverable. And I will say that my talk does not necessarily target a younger audience type of game design. I want to target the niche of the older Roblox users that want to look for more depth in their gameplay.